Namaste and welcome to the 2008 Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture, the sixth in the series hosted by the Social Science Baha. I'm Bandita Shizapati, a member of the Social Science Baha. To give you a very brief background on the lecture series, the Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture was instituted by the Social Science Baha in 2003 to honor the seminal contribution made by the late historian Mahesh Chandra Regmi to Nepali scholarship. The first lecture was delivered by the late Dr. Harka Gurung in the presence of Mahesh Chandra Regmi himself. The goal of this annual lecture is to serve as a platform to allow well-known scholars to present their ideas to Nepali society. We are really honored to have with us today Professor David Ludden, who will be delivering the lecture titled, "Where is the Revolution Towards a Post-National Politics of Social Justice?" To introduce Professor Ludden, we have Pratish Wanta, who is also a member of the Social Science Baha. Dr. Wanta is a well-known public intellectual who has written about Nepali nationalism, Gorkha history, institutions, area studies, and the media. It so happens that Dr. Wanta's PhD supervisor at the University of Pennsylvania was Professor David Ludden, but I'm sure he'll talk more about that in the introduction that he'll be giving. Please note that since this is a public lecture, we won't be able to entertain any questions from the audience. We have, however, made available copies of the lecture, which you can pick up as you leave the hall at the end of the lecture. I would also like to inform you that all the lectures from the previous years can be downloaded from the Social Science Baha's website. Without any further delay, I would now like to request Dr. Wanta to introduce Professor Ludden. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bandita. And I'd like to begin by thanking my colleagues and friends at the Social Science Bar for giving me this really pleasurable task of introducing Professor David Ludden. David Ludden has just finished his first year as Professor of History at New York University, NYU for short, in New York City. His exact designation there is Professor of Political Economy and Globalization. He tells me that this designation comes from NYU's effort to hire historians not based on the areas of the world where they have done their research, but more on the thematic focus of their interests and research. That's the first I have heard as far as the historians go, although it's quite common for anthropologists to be hired that way. David has been a student of South Asian history and society for 40 years now. As an undergraduate at Yale University in the late 1960s, he had to outsmart those who were responsible for recruiting college students to fight America's war in Vietnam to be able to take what U.S. colleges today call junior year abroad. He spent that year in a village just outside of what was then Madras city, but he tells me that the village where he spent that year is now actually part of Greater Chennai. In the preface to his first book, Peasant History in South India, published by Princeton University Press in 1985, this was his revised dissertation. He recalled his first year just outside of Madras in the following manner, and I quote him: "Eager to be useful in a small health facility there, I lived through a year of drought among people in villages that ring the huge Ambatar irrigation tank, bone dry during the whole of the 1968 agricultural year. Nobody spoke Tamil the way my text and tutor said they should. Paralyzed by conflict, the health facility accomplished little of what I had anticipated. Worst of all, health problems I had thought could be solved by medication, care, vitamins, and education turned out to be symptoms of poverty inherited by undernourished dry laborers. Frustration and confusion prompted me to begin studying in earnest for the first time." I mean, this is in contrast to the 2 aimless years he had spent in Yale, according to himself. When he returned to the US, it was clear that his goals to learn more Tamil and more South Asian history were not going to be fulfilled at Yale. So he moved to University of Pennsylvania to finish his BA. University of Pennsylvania has the oldest South Asia focused area studies program in the US, one that had been established by the late W. Norman Brown immediately after World War II. After he finished his BA there, David continued graduate studies at Penn and studied with the likes of Holden Ferber and Tom Kissinger. Under Kissinger, who gained his fame in the South Asian study circles in the US for his early 1980s local history book called Vilayatpur 1848-1968, David finished his dissertation in 1968 by writing, not surprisingly, a very local history of the Tirunel Valley region of Tamil Nadu. A revised version of it was published as his first book mentioned above, and in it he explored, in his own words, the implications of putting peasants at the center of the social historiography of agrarian civilizations. Specialists describe the book as both ambitious and excellent, one that was able to, in the words of one reviewer, break new grounds for peasants in the social history of the subcontinent. David's interest in agrarian history has remained. We can see this from his long list of publications, especially articles on the subject, and from his second monograph entitled An Agrarian History of South Asia, published in 1999 as part of the Cambridge University Press's The New Cambridge History of India monograph series. We can also see this from the title of at least one volume of essays he has edited, Agricultural Production and Indian History, published in 1994 by OUP. In addition to agrarian history, David is broadly interested in the comparative history of capitalisms, economic development, empire, inequality, mobility, and social conflict. He has also been interested in some of the more recent concerns of social and cultural histories of South Asia, namely subaltern studies and the rise of the Hindutva forces in India. These interests have been reflected in books he has edited, including Contesting the Nation, Religion, Community and the Politics of Democracy in India. This was published by Penn Press in 1996, and its South Asian edition was reissued under the different title called Making India Hindu. Another book he has edited is Reading Subaltern Studies, Critical History, Contested Meaning and the Globalization of South Asia, published in 2002 by Permanent Black. And more recently, Capitalism in South Asia, published by the Association for Asian Studies. He has also written an introductory text of South Asian history entitled India and South Asia, or Short History, published in 2002 by One World Publications. In 1981, David was hired by the History Department of the University of Pennsylvania as an assistant professor, and he remained in its faculty until June of this year, the last 10 years in the capacity of a full professor. However, over the last 2 years, he took what I can describe as a long sabbatical into early retirement from Penn and gradually moved to NYU, first as a visiting professor and now a full member of its history faculty. During his long years at Penn, he was also affiliated with its South Asia Regional Studies Department, which he headed for a number of years. Until the late 1990s, that is before he got fed up with departmental politics in both his home Department of History and the South Asia Regional Studies Department, he also ran the regular seminar series related to South Asia and ethnohistory in collaboration with his various colleagues. While at Penn, he supervised the PhD dissertation of several students, including that of mine. David has served as the president of the Association for Asian Studies, the largest member-based professional organization of academics who study Asia. He has also served in the South Asia-related advisory bodies of the Social Science Research Council and the Fulbright Commission. I first met David when I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania in August 1988, exactly 20 years ago, to pursue a PhD in economics. However, pretty soon I convinced myself that staying in that program could drive me crazy. Hence, to retain my sanity, I started attending the year-long seminar on what was called Orientalism and Beyond, organized by David, fellow historian Carol A. Breckenridge, and philosopher, the late William Hoffass, while taking the standard micro, macro, and econometrics series courses in the economics department. After passing the first year exams in the economics PhD program and with help from David, Carroll, and the economic historian Alan Heston, who has also retired from Penn, I engineered a way out of the economics department and started studying South Asian history with all three of them. Between fall 1989 and fall 1991, I took several courses with David, Carroll, Alan, Amitav Ghosh, now better known as a fiction writer, Peter van der Veer, and others. And those were the golden years of my student life, and they formed the foundation for just about everything I have done since. What I liked best about David's style of teaching was its informality, something I have tried to replicate in the history and society model that I teach in the immersion course run by Social Science Baha. Despite his astounding success as a historian, the late Mahesh Chandra Regmi was a humble person. You could tell that from anybody who met him, even when his body was failing him in the 90s, you could tell that. And one could pretty much say the same thing about David. I would also add that there is remarkable similarity between Regmi's interest in the agrarian conditions faced by our 18th and 19th century ancestors in Nepal and David's long-standing interest in the lives of 18th and 19th century peasants in South India. Among the 6 people who have given the Regmi lecture, David is the only full-time historian, where we could say Kumar Pradhan, journalist / historian. Alas, all of them have been new. David comes to Kathmandu from Dhaka, where he spends a good part of each year with his Bangladeshi partner, the anthropologist Dina Siddiqui, and their daughter Mohana. Under one scenario, it is likely that they will spend even greater part of each year in Bangladesh in the not too distant future. If that were to happen, we would be able to bring him to Kathmandu many times each year, and I'm certainly looking forward to those days. Now, let me invite Professor Ludden to deliver the 2008 Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture.
Thank you, Pratush. I'm very, very honored to be here, and I will be speaking to you today on a subject matter that is related to my longer term, as Pratush reminds me of a very long-term, old man type of historical life, but it focuses on some problems of locality. I mean, I've actually been studying localities in the context of larger histories my whole life, and locating the locality and where the localities are has actually become a major issue in my work. So that really is the link between what I'm going to talk about today and what Pratush has been telling you. Another link, of course, is that I've been actually very inspired by Nepal in the last decade or so. I've come every few years, 3 or 4 years, 2 or 3 years like that, and every time I come, I get involved in conversations with Pratush and friends and colleagues here, and it's like there's a different country every time I come. So it's really quite an amazingly transforming kind of environment. And when I received this very kind invitation to deliver this lecture, I thought this really has to be the time for me to really bite the bullet and face a problem that I've been trying to grapple with as a part of this this book that I'm trying to finish now, which has to do with the nature of radical major social transformations and the way in which localities and small-scale units fit into that in the context of national, regional, South Asian, Asian, global type of historical context. So with that in mind, I will launch myself off on something that I hope will be done in 40 minutes or so from now, so you don't have to stay too long. And my goal will actually be to create a framework for thinking about Nepal today in a way that's not pegged too specifically to the particularities of Nepal's situation, but rather locates the problems that we, I would say, are facing in Nepal in a context that is what I call post-national, a context where the nation and the nation-state is situated within a variety of different analytical frames and doesn't provide by itself the only way to think about the history of the people who are living inside a particular country. I call it post-national only as a kind of a convenience for arguing that the nation, thinking strictly in terms of the nation-state, can actually, and the national boundaries and national territories, as I will argue, actually obstructs our thinking about certain important historical transformations. And so, with that in view, I'll begin. I grew up in an age of anti-imperial nationalist revolutions. When I was in graduate school in the 1970s, rustic revolutionaries provided a real-world present and also a historical context for my studies of agrarian history. Peasant wars in Germany, Russia, China, Vietnam, Algeria, Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, and on, represented radical agrarian politics to me. They fired my imagination and opened new worlds of political possibilities that I hadn't never really imagined living in my little cocoon in the United States. But in South Asia, the more I understood things in South Asia, I realized that these kinds of revolutionary movements of the sort that I had come to appreciate so much really didn't appear in South Asia. The revolutionary activities in South Asia, as far as I could tell, the more I studied them, had much more localized characteristic, localized outlook, localized frames of reference, conduct, theoretical perspectives, and so on. They were operating in circles of villages and small regions and in particular bits of national territory. So I didn't think that these were real revolutions at all, and thus I thought, well, this explains, well, why they're so obscure, why none of my colleagues had ever heard of them. Few people cared even, what was the point? Who cared about learning about the Chautal rebels who fought the Jomindar landlords in 19th century Bengal, or the Mapalas of Malabar who fought the government and various competitors for land rights until the 1920s in South India, or Telangana revolutionaries who were forced underground by the Indian Army in the early 1950s, but who actually still survive in various forms, or their Maoist cousins in Naxalbari who were likewise driven underground and who likewise survive, as we all know, in various forms. Nobody around the world really had much to care about these characters. And in fact, South Asian historians themselves, until the 1980s, except for some laudatory, descriptive accounts, for the most part, these revolutionary movements were thought of as rebellions, insurgencies, and so on, and never really classified or conceptualized as real revolutions at all. The sort of the crowning glory of this analysis, which people probably know about, is a book by Ranajit Guha called Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency, a book that helped to launch the series and the School of Historical Studies called Subaltern Studies in 1982. And among other things, in that book, Professor Guha catalogs the limiting factors that prevented rebels in South Asia from mounting real, that is, national revolutions. His models of success were undoubtedly revolutions in Vietnam and China, which, as I will point out shortly, today appear in rather different light than they did in 1982. Another difference between Professor Guha's approach and my own is that he stops his history, as many people do, in 1947. In fact, officially in India, there's still a tendency in the schools to do that. There's a movement by various historians to try to expand history to include the last 50 years, 60 years now. But for the most part, history stops in 1947 officially. But if instead you try to bring your history down to the present and think of the present as being part of history, it opens up rather different kinds of opportunities of thought. And in this respect, I like to follow the motto of an American historian named William Appleman Williams, who said, history is a way of learning. It begins by leaving the present, by going back into the heretofore, by beginning again, not by staying in the present and looking back at the past, but rather by going back to the past and returning then to the present with a wider and more intense consciousness of the restrictions of our former outlook. We return with a broader awareness of the alternatives that are open to us, with a sharper perceptiveness with which to make our choices in the here and now. In this manner, we can transform the dead hand of the past into a living tool for the present and future. This is a quote. I just love that quote. It makes a lot of sense to me. In the last 60 years of history in South Asia, I think we can find that localized movements for social justice, many including revolutionary energies, violence, and even warfare, have repeatedly pitted insurgent forces against defenders of the status quo. These movements have recently, or in the last 60 years or so, been a major force in modern transformations, reshaping political economies all across Southern Asia. And in fact, if we go back in time and we start looking a little bit more carefully at what agrarian, local, peasant, rural histories really look like in South Asia, I think you'll find that a very, very large number of very localized movements have made a huge difference in the transformation of South Asian agrarian environments from medieval times to the present. And I think that with this in view, what's occurred to me, or I've been sort of, my brain has slowly conceptualized the idea that spatial limitations of the sort that we find in South Asia might actually be thought of as virtues and strengths rather than as weaknesses. And so it's this kind of thought that I'm sort of working with these days, rather than thinking that revolution has to transform whole countries in one big bang, that there actually are whole different ways of thinking about a revolutionary activity. Localized revolutionary practices, are beginning to argue, have actually succeeded in changing their world many times, and they present very useful, positive lessons for us and for political analysts and strategists, for decision makers, for people who really have to make decisions about how to proceed politically in the present. So this is step number one in what I'm calling my post-national perspective. That is to valorize local activity, to valorize activity that's not even conceptualized as being national, that's not conducted in a national way, that doesn't identify with the nation, but is identified rather with fragments, with bits and pieces, with localities, and so on. I'm beginning to appreciate that the spatial limitations of such localized movements are useful because they focus attention on what matters most for local people. They follow localized political logics that do not correspond with nationalist or cosmopolitan ideas of revolution. And localization makes them, in fact, more flexible in the face of changing conditions, more sensitive to changing environments, more adaptable, and, in the long run, I think probably even more sustainable. Without going into the details of many examples, which would take a whole semester or a year to do, I'll just simply say that I think that if you begin to explore this kind of topic, you find that very old traditions of local political assertiveness have changed in form and content over the centuries, as they've worked inside medieval kingdoms, early modern empires, modern imperialism, and now national states. When they're waged against British rule, as they were in Ranajit Guha's work, they look like anti-imperialism. When they're waged against the nation-state, they look like secessionism. And now some of them appear even anti-capitalist because they're fighting the status quo of neoliberal globalization with its national administrators and imperial armies, UN-sanctioned or not. Politically speaking, localism has many advantages. Small regions comprised of tightly connected localities, filled with people who feel deeply their own cultural, social, and economic commonalities, provide a solid basis for sustained solidarity. Small regions are more politically coherent than nations. Their communities are based on oral traditions, not on literacy, on face-to-face relationships, not on media icons and movie stars and occasional visits by national leaders. They have complicated solidarities, including lots of internal conflicts, which can last for generations, but that very lasting of the conflict for generations indicates how they're steeped in local realities. Small regions are typically have some kind of status inside the nation-state or inside the state administration. It's typically the case that localities have some kind of official status inside a national or imperial state administration. And so therefore the locality has a kind of a purchase on at least a bit of what Benedict Anderson calls the nation as the imagined community. And in fact, in South Asia in general, the idea of the village as being a kind of a microcosm of national identity is a good example of this. And this kind of status provides localities with a state legitimacy, and so that official leaders are actually located in a kind of strategic spot between the state and local society. Local authority can be turned to tasks of state integration, to law and order, to repression and control, or to resistance and rebellion. Local leaders can be organizers of football teams, of business ventures, of NGOs, or struggles for social justice. The local leaders have a lot of options that they can pursue. Albert Hirschman, an old-time economist, very, very interesting man, once described three kinds of strategic options that people have in relation to organizations, and he described there's three. He calls them exit. They're called loyalty, voice, and exit. Okay. Loyalty is simple, everyday loyalty to a regime, and usually the propensity to enforce loyalty among others. Voice is that option of expressing dissent, of demanding reform, engaging in protest, and so on. And exit means renouncing loyalty, opting out, seeking other options. He argues that there's different situations under which people can do these kinds of things. And I want you to note right away that the exit option does not necessarily mean revolution. In fact, typically it does not. Disgruntled people can simply leave. They can migrate to live and work somewhere else. In pre-modern times, this was easily done. In fact, most of areas of South Asia are populated by people who did leave somewhere else and who went to somewhere and settled there instead. There were lots of lands for open cultivation. Lots of migratory possibilities were there. But as time went by, as modernity began to move in, the situation changed little by little, but really quite dramatically over the long view. Barriers to migration increased, state borders became more rigorous, state territories became more disciplined. This process accelerated in the 19th century and became universally really effective and very significant in the 20th, the second half in particular, when national state borders enclosed all human territories everywhere in the world. Every human being in the world lives inside a national territory defined officially on the maps of the world. It's really quite astounding. Modern exit options continued to include migration, of course, but people more and more had to choose other options, other ways to exit. So they engaged in silent secession movements and quiet non-compliance and subtle subversion, corruption, social deviance, criminality, and such. These kinds of invisible, what I call invisible exit options that people engaged in are very, very popular in scholarly literature today. James Scott describes this as being a typical situation for mountain people in mainland Southeast Asia who simply opted out of the nation-states in which they are officially contained. Subaltern studies sees this kind of silent exit option as being typical among agrarian subalterns in British India, and where outward compliance and secretive inner resistance to colonial domination made British rule culturally illegitimate and denied Western dominance the privilege of hegemony. This is also one way to think about the underworld, what I call the underworld of governance, run, for example, by the mafia in Sicily, by drug lords in the Golden Triangle, and by gang lords in impoverished places like Chors and slums and coastal waterways of Bangladesh. There's lots of places in South Asia, certainly in Bangladesh, that are basically run by people who have already exited from the state system. So that revolution is a very, very rare option for people to take. It really requires a huge kind of commitment. And it always begins in localities. It begins in small regions where local leaders choose the exit option, but then turn their minds to building a new legitimate state regime in the face of violent repression by defenders of the status quo. There's lots of ways to exit. Revolution isn't just exiting. Revolution is trying to alter the situation in which you live in a very strong way. And it always faces opposition. In fact, the nature of the opposition determines, or very significantly determines, the course of the political process. As Iqbal Ahmed, one of my absolute favorite scholars, described the conditions of revolution in 1965 in this way. The conditions leading to revolutionary war are not created by conspiracy. They are inherent in the dislocations and demands produced by rapid social change and are predicated on the failure of ruling elites to respond to the challenges of modernization. The pressures for change in the political, economic, and social relationships of the past inevitably lead to confrontation with those whose interests lie in the maintenance of the status quo. In countries and colonies whose rulers are willing to abdicate their monopoly of power and privileges, where genuine reforms are introduced and new institutions begin to provide for a sharing of power and responsibility, the change is effected in an orderly, if not entirely peaceful and democratic manner. But when a ruling class resists reforms, which invariably mean a reduction in its power and privileges, its confrontation with the new political forces becomes increasingly violent. A regime unwilling to satisfy popular aspirations begins to lose legitimacy. Revolutionary forces deliberately accelerate this process of reducing their legitimacy by weakening the efficacy and cohesion of the ruling elite and by giving form to the amorphous revolutionary conflagration. Thus, a successful revolution must create a legitimate alternative to an existing state. And that legitimacy needs to be, always is, necessarily initially a locally legitimate one. It's not necessarily legitimate at the national level. Very important to remember. The revolution starts small. To grow, it must scale itself up spatially and institutionally. How far it expands, whether or not, and how it subsumes and transforms an entire state structure depends on the extent to which and in what manner forces of local and regional rebellion can be combined to capture the state apparatus based in the capital city. Arriving in the capital and changing politics there mark only small steps on a long road that inevitably leads back to the localities. New regimes must begin by consolidating a command structure to institutionalize the regime in localities and regions. The survival of a new regime depends on its work in localities and regions. Political analysts typically spend a disproportionate amount of their time focusing on events in capital cities and in the nation as a whole. And most analysts still actually deploy Cold War classifications to separate communist regimes or communist political forces from non-communist ones. This distinction really isn't very useful anymore, I don't think. It's more useful to observe one very important feature of all these modern revolutionary movements, which is that they share a common trend of regionalization or decentralization. And this is something that you really see very starkly in the latter decades of the 20th century. In the early days, these new national state regimes based on revolutionary movements or non-revolutionary movements, either way, they all follow the strong desire to establish a centralized national model of development. But then, little by little, often without proclamations, but with quickening pace, power and authority devolve to regions and to localities. The reason for this is actually quite simple. The ambitions of the nation are beyond the central management of the central government, and so the demands from localities are more than the central government, any central government can manage. The localities are demanding more resources, more flexible decision-making, and so on, and the solution is for regional and local authorities to take more responsibility over local governments. This process is visible everywhere in Asia in the latter part of the 20th century, and each national regime has worked out interactive accommodations between central state authorities and regional groupings of local social forces. In recent decades, neoliberal globalization has accompanied this decentralization, pushing it along and being pushed along by it as businesses seek to reduce costs in their expanding global networks. Globalization has also benefited from the expansion of state powers in regions and localities. In this light, I like to think of, I'm so glad I'm in the Russian Cultural Center, because I just came back from Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia, and I realized that the so-called demise of the Soviet Union could actually be thought of in very, very different ways, it could be thought of as a regional reorganization, a decentralization, a re-territorialization of a very old Russian imperial space, which is still probably a long way from being over. In other words, a spatial reorganization is what basically is involved. Another way to think about this decentralization process is in terms of the multiplication of the number of national states that there are in the world today. When I was in graduate school, there were 120, 130, 140. Then there's statistics go on, and you can see if you do long-term statistics that anybody who's an economist trying to do global statistics realize that some countries just keep arriving in the statistical tables, and so you really can't do long-term studies of their data at all. There's 205 countries that were registered to be in the Beijing Olympics this year. Brunei didn't come, so it turned out to be 204. So the number of nation states has been increasing too. It's another example of another kind of spatial reorganization, decentralization process. In the last few decades, under communist and capitalist regimes alike, and all other types, regions and localities have increased their powers and responsibilities in relation to state administration. This does not mean the state is becoming weaker. It doesn't mean that at all. It doesn't mean it's becoming less powerful or less in control of local resources. It means that the locus of that power is being changed and shifting more toward localities and small regions. The recent trend in the rise of the locality thus marks an intersection of trends in globalization and inside national regimes. As investors seek opportunities in specific localities that need regional infrastructure, states are also seeking to provide attractive localities for global business. So urban hotspots like Bangalore, Bombay, Hyderabad are occupying networks of cities in which capital is moving around and in which countries are actually trying to provide particular places that are attractive for businesses to operate. And in this context, new kinds of localities and new local configurations are emerging. Some of these are well known, like the metropolitans, the big metros, and the big urban centers. Others are less well appreciated, but actually in some ways actually more significant as innovations. The economic processing zones or special economic zones that are proliferating throughout the world are really quite important in this respect. In the 1960s, there were only 10. In the 1980s, there were 176 EPZs in 47 countries. And in 2003, there were 3,000 special economic zones and EPZs in 116 different countries. We can also consider such phenomena, which people don't usually do, such as the proliferation of U.S. military facilities around the world, as another kind of creation of special purpose localities that are designed to create a network of operations throughout the world that are based in particular localities. Localities in small regions have thus gained new prominence under globalization, and so have local struggles for social justice, such as the ongoing fight over farmland seized by communist governments in West Bengal, which is really overland being seized for special economic zones in West Bengal by a communist government, and struggles over wages and in the face of price rise in garment factories in Bangladesh. And these struggles, like those of the Zapatistas and various other groups in Latin America, they make the headlines only when they confront national states which have political interests that are both oriented toward the globalization process and toward localities at the same time. So the nation state is actually poised in a very funny, precarious situation between a localization and a regionalization of political economies at a subnational level and a globalization of political and economic power and relationships at a supranational level. In this context, when you're thinking about localities, you don't think of them only as being part of nation states. You can also think of them as being part of larger spaces of globalization. This is why I'm thinking about a post-national framework for thinking about struggles of social justice, Because now, when you're thinking about what struggles like this look like, they're not only national anymore, they're national, local, global, all at the same time, in various mixes in different kinds of ways. And that nation-states are actually drawing their strength from their relationship with both of these different types of struggles. It's not as though the nation-state is being torn apart by these local struggles, but rather it's drawing new strength and new vitality from the interaction of local activities and global activities at the same time. So in this concept, in this framework, I'm thinking that the phenomenon of spatial limitation of social movements, of political movements, particularly of radical political movements, is actually quite important to focus on. Now, limitation of this kind only makes sense in larger contexts, right? You have to be a larger context in order to have something that are smaller. And spatial limits are forming constituents of national territories inside globalization. And these limits are designing localities and regions part of whose identity derives from the activity of the nation-state itself. So the nation-state is defining what a locality is. But in addition to that, these localities have other constituent features, other characteristics that are not defined by the nation-state. In fact, I would argue that throughout South Asia and in much of Asia, the localities are actually prior to the nation-state. They're older, they're more durable, and historically speaking, they have separate types of histories and that need to be brought into consideration. So local politics and state authority are operating in spatial limits that aren't just set by the state. The state isn't the only definer of what spatial limitation is. There's also other important factors, and I like to emphasize three. One is language, of course. Another is literacy. Actually, is the ability to access language in such a way as to conceptualize the world that you live in. And the third is actually mobility, social mobility, and social networks, actual interconnections that people have with one another. Now, all of these dynamics that are creating limitations and creating territories are operating in changing world environments, but the point I want to underline in this little part of my presentation is that they're all living inside what I call nature's geography at the same time. So that nature's topography, nature's characteristics actually end up having political significance. All of the capitals of all the countries in Asia are located inside certain kind of specialized lowland agrarian commercial environments from which power and authority of states and empires and nations have radiated outwards. Literacy, population, routes of transportation and communication, institutions, investments of all kinds concentrate in these privileged plains, basins, valleys, and so on. This is where the big cities are. These are the strategic points where routes of mobility meet fertile land for cultivation. All political territories in Asia are, therefore, you can think of them as being complex historical assemblages where spatial designs have changed over time. There's all sorts of different changes in the borders and so on. But no matter what the changes in the borders are, there's always the imprint of nature's geography that you can find without too much work. And two examples I like to use where this is not necessarily so easily appreciated are examples from Tamil Nadu, as you could expect, and from Bengal. In South India, basically Tamil Nadu was formed out of a collection of coastal river basins which had never been united politically at all until the 19th century. And then when they were united politically in the 19th century, there was a very strong political movement to unite them more and more around the dominant language of the region, which is Tamil. So that the unification of the region was based on similarities of the territories first, of political unification of the territories second, and of a linguistic national movement third. These things came together in modern times. In Bengal, in the Bengal Delta, there are some similarities. The physical characteristics of the delta as a rice-growing floodplain sustained a cultural vision of unity, of physical cultural unity among the Bengalis, which, like among the Tamils, was based originally on one dominant literary language. Not the oral language, but the literary language. So there's a difference between language and literacy here. But in this case, in the case of Bengal, there was a big difference because patterns of settlement and of political organization actually ended up pulling this territory apart. So what is a physically and culturally very organized kind of Bengali space was politically split into two countries in 1947. So these are examples of ways in which the complicated relationship between physical space and cultural and political space don't necessarily make it so obvious what the outcome will be. But there are other types of physical spaces where the general outlines of the outcomes of political outcomes are actually fairly clear. And one set of these kinds of spaces are mountains, and the other are the vast migratory spaces of the plains of the steppe. High mountain areas in South Asia and in Asia in generally have very distinctive political characteristics. Mountains separate populations from one another. They separate linguistic groups, societies from one another, and they separate those societies from the peoples of the plains. Also, likewise, in contrast to the plains, dry open steppe lands are filled historically with nomadic peoples who have distinctive political qualities derived from their peripatetic ways of life. The contrast between the fertile plains on the one hand and the mountains in the steppe on the other is really quite important politically. Bringing mountain people and nomadic people into state territories based in the lowlands, agrarian lowlands, has been a very long political process and is still very far from being over. Building most Asian states has entailed the mingling of distinctive types of political worlds which typify mountains, fertile lowlands, and nomadic steppes, respectively, each filled with its own kinds of localities, its own ways of life, languages, circuits of social interaction, and so on. Localities in the fertile plains provide the substance for the nation's imagined community in the cultural products of the literary elites of the lowlands. This is true everywhere in Asia, so that the localities of the lowlands participate in the national space in a way that is totally seamlessly connected with the literary products of the literary elites who are based in the lowlands. While the people in the mountains live in localities where illiteracy and separations of territories create much more of a sense of enclosure, of separation from the plains, of isolation from the national community. These are places that anthropologists often describe as being in another world, another place separated from national mainstream. Bringing mountain people into conformity with state norms and national elite ideals might seem to be a simple continuation of the nation's economic and social development. It might seem that national states embrace mountains and plains in one continuous political space. But that appearance is deceptive, I would say, because mountain regions are always distinctive and typically more difficult for lowland states to integrate effectively into national territory. We can appreciate this distinctiveness by looking up into the mountains from the Indo-Gangetic lowlands. Since ancient times, high mountains have marked borderlands of Indo-Gangetic state expansion. From the Hindu Kush in the west to Assam in the east, from the Himalayas in the north to the Vindhyas in the south, the integration of mountain peoples into Indo-Gangetic lowland state territories occurred only in places where lowland people conquered and settled in the mountains. And that integration has always been contested locally, as it is today all across northeastern India and the Chittagong hill tracts in Bangladesh. Looking further east, we see similar dynamics in all mountain ranges that span South, Southeast, and East Asia. Since the 18th century, China has been expanding across mountains by building roads, continuing today, coming down, expanding lowland settlements in the highlands, and bringing mountain peoples into the Chinese economy. As a result, the distinctiveness of mountain cultures has steadily diminished in China. To the dismay of anthropologists and local resistors, the same thing is happening in Vietnam, and by contrast, however, if we want to think of the opposite of Vietnam and China, in this respect, we can look at Burma and India, where there's been constant upheaval for the last 60 years because of the inability to integrate mountain peoples into regions that actually span the territories between South Asia and Southeast Asia. In all of these areas, war and fighting by mountain people against lowland states is really quite a normal phenomenon. It's in various ways it happens all the time. Thus we can see that national maps can be very, very deceptive. First of all, because they erase nature's geography, and therefore they distort our understanding of what political space actually looks like by erasing, in this case, the mountains, high mountains, from our appreciation of what national space look like. And I say also that by doing this, they distort our perspective on revolution. And they do further damage to our understanding of revolutionary environments by erasing inequality. National maps show every nation's territory as being composed of the same substance. The flat and homogeneous color of the nation spreads evenly from border to border, symbolizing the formally equivalent status of all citizens. We imbibe the logic of these maps from an early age. From our early school days, we learn that the nation is natural, inevitable, even God-given in some renditions. It is naturally peaceful, harmonious. All citizens are as one. All are part of our nation. In this kind of context, rebels appear on the scene as disruptive, destabilizing, painful, like an infection needing some kind of a cure. It's important to note here that this kind of image of the national space is very much the one that neoliberal globalization theories are utilizing. Neoclassical economics conceives the world as being composed of transactions among equivalent individuals in equivalent national places, where markets operate in a world where nation-states make laws that pertain evenly across the sovereign space of national territory, and where progress derives from laws which enable rational individual market actors to allocate resources most efficiently in free market transactions. So it's a framework. It's a flat world framework within which the world is conceptualized in neoliberal globalization. We understand nations better, however, and we orient our minds much better to the problem of revolution by inserting geography and inequality into our geographical understanding of political space. In reality, nations do not appear from nowhere. They've been assembled by power and conquest, by people who are not equal to others, in places that are not equal. In reality, every national territory on Earth has an imperial history and retains characteristics of imperial territory. Imperial territories are composed of transactions within ranks of inequality. Empire is a process of producing and sustaining ranks that distinguish people with unequal power and authority. In imperial territory, voluntary social transactions include coercive capacities above and subordinate adaptations below. Imperial societies are composed of structured power relations among explicitly, officially unequal actors, whose transactions dramatize their inequality. Places, of course, are also unequal in imperial space, because people and assets are always living in places that are unequal to one another. People are moving up and down among the ranks of places, from lower status places typically to higher status places. It's very rare to find people moving from richer places to poorer places. Usually they go the other way around, and it's called social mobility, and it's typically called, in fact, upward mobility, because of this moving on up kind of framework. In a situation in which rich neighborhoods and capital cities are on top of the heap, and poor slums and remote areas are at the bottom of the heap. In contrast to national ideas of territory, empire is always mobile also, and has no fixed boundaries. It operates in shifting layer territories, where territory is actually never controlled evenly. The imperial territory is never this kind of flat, homogeneous space. There are some places that are much more densely controlled, and there's other places that are just not worth the trouble, that are out on the fringes, and that basically are a continuous law and order nightmare. Rebels appear rather differently when you think of space in this kind of way. They emerge within ranks of inequality from obscure, remote local origins. Their assertions of power represents a rise of local demands for recognition, for the redress of grievances, for reform, in short, for redistributions of power expressed by people in lower ranks to those above, who must respond. The rebels' goal is to speak truth to power and convince people at a higher rank that local demands need tending to, that inequalities need fixing. Rebels take on new meaning when national ideas take hold. In other words, when the idea of nationality begins to fix itself inside revolutionary localities, revolutions actually begin to change their identity. And this happened really in the 19th and particularly in the 20th centuries, as revolutionaries began to strive to turn on the inequalities of imperial space into the equivalent equalities of national space, where national citizens could all participate. So if the nation is actually to become what it really wants to be, in a sense, the nation isn't a thing at all, but rather it's a project. It's a project of altering the characteristics of imperial environments in which nationals are living. In this kind of project, the limitation of radical politics begins to mark the exposure and also potentially the reproduction of spatial inequality. Because you could note right away that if it were the case that spatial inequalities were totally eliminated, if all peoples and places and national territories were actually all identical, local politics would actually be unnecessary. Policies devised in capitals would suffice for everyone. Until then, however, we need localized politics to represent particular interests of specific groups and in different kinds of places to represent the nature of those places that are participating in larger scale polities. People in rural areas, urban areas, mountain areas, lowland areas, and so on. These are people who are all living inside existing inequalities they're raising some people over others, and where revolutionary, radical types of activities will necessarily be possible, and whose emergence would actually create a dynamic process. So, Thinking about the nation as being basically an egalitarian type of project that we undertake in the context of deep, widespread inequality implies that nations require serious struggle to become what they seek to become. That is what makes national maps so problematic, because they depict the nation as being static. We imbibe this imagery in school, where we learn, in effect, that loyalty is the prime virtue. Less privileged people in less privileged places actually experience inequality in a much more poignant way, and they're much more likely to generate radical action that could provide a generative force in the context of existing inequalities. National maps portray the nation as a static natural unity of people and the state, an idea that makes sense for the ruling elites, for whom the identity of the state and of the people, it makes total sense for them. And it may also make sense for the networks of relationships they have with local leaders, local elites, and local power structures, that actually bring the nation together inside a whole set of relationships of inequality of the imperial variety. So that purging empire from the nation is a complicated phenomenon. It's complicated by the fact that modernity is steeped with all these imperial characteristics. Modern political territories emerged in the 19th century as imperial state territorialism became more stringent. Modern state powers of resource control still sustain modern ideas and institutions of economic development and modernization today. Without state control over assets, we don't have a development process, actually. Social access to goods and services still depend upon state sanctions. Localities have thus become sites of state discipline, as local elites have become local state authorities, and local elite wealth and power and privilege have become intimately entwined in the dynamics of state power. And it's this local entanglement of local elite power with large-scale state power that actually creates the framework within which revolutions occur. The nation emerged inside the modern state as people within state territories imagined themselves to be citizen rulers, and struggles ensued to confront imperial inequalities in localities and in states simultaneously. Nations have followed different trajectories based on their imperial heritage. Russia and China were old empires, which national revolutions had to conquer as a whole. In new empires built by Europeans, as in Asia and India and so on, nations had to invent themselves during the struggle for independence itself. That's when the nations actually came into existence. In independent kingdoms like Nepal and Thailand, there was a kind of a smooth movement from into national statehood from previous royal traditions. In all these different environments, struggles for social justice acquired different forms and meanings because during these national transitions. Everywhere, struggles against imperial inequality took regional forms. And two examples that I like to use that I think are important and interesting and telling come from British India, and they indicate some of the types of differences in these struggles, but also one similarity, which is that all these local struggles face a common problem in nationalist conservatism. Now I have the two examples from Tamil Nadu and from Bengal. In the Tamil-speaking region of South India, which was unified politically for the first time under British rule, local officials who provided revenue and administration services for the modern state were also local landed and service elites, Brahmins and high-caste non-Brahmins. The circular migration of these elites to and from cities, towns, and villages formed networks of recruitment and social mobility that produced South India's urban middle class. In the capital, however, Brahmins had unequal advantage. They controlled educational resources, state resources, and professional careers available to Indians. They also joined the Indian National Congress to improve their opportunities and to create the definition of the Indian nation. Upward social mobility for non-Brahmin elites faced serious obstruction from Brahmin privileges in the capital, which Congress implicitly accepted. The Justice Party rose against this inequality in elections in the 1920s, and from then on, removing caste barriers to upward mobility became a core demand of radical politics in South India, and then in Western India, and then in all of India eventually as time went by. Caste continues to frame struggles for social justice in India, and people actually, we discuss ethnicity in Nepal. In India, people do not have a choice as to whether to use caste as a political idiom. It's a political idiom that's built into struggles throughout the 20th century. And the elites, most of whom had some kind of connection with Zamindari elites, formed a Hindu Bhadralok that became the basis for the Indian National Congress, and its basis inside the Zamindari privilege systems of local Zamindari privilege actually made it impossible for the Congress to come out in favor of tenant rights throughout most of its history. In the eyes of the Congress, before 1947, in the eyes of the Congress, India was one national unified space. It was one, and that unity was paramount. Congress leaders believed that Indian unity would suffer if particular local demands favored particularly lower castes and particular regions would enter into the national program. Congress embraced a totalizing national vision of the nation, and this national vision basically erased the inequity built inside the Indian nation itself. Bengali tenants throughout the Bengal countryside therefore abandoned the Congress. They exited the Congress. They looked for other options. Many of them found options in the Muslim League, and this led eventually to the partition of India in 1947, but also, interestingly, to the rise of communist politics in West Bengal, which emerged from the same kind of radical local roots and struggles against Zamindari. In the 1950s, This very same struggle for social justice in eastern Bengal basically overthrew the Muslim League and launched the movement for Bangladesh. Again, the issue was the recognition of local demands for representation. Pakistan refused to recognize that Bengalis had specific needs and legitimate demands. The politics of recognition, which demanded devolution of state power in East Pakistan, met implacable opposition in West Pakistan, and as Iqbal Ahmed would have predicted, war ensued. A similar progression has occurred in Sri Lanka, in northeast India, and in Kashmir. And in such cases, loyalty, in all these cases it's quite interesting, loyalty and voice come together initially, but voice moves toward exit when demands are not met for the recognition of grievances and for the politics of recognition are essentially denied. In all these cases also, I have to point out, in the capital, the nation is conceived as a unitary whole, whereas in the countryside and the localities, the nation is conceived as being composed of very, very unequal parts, which have to somehow relate and deal and fight with each other. So now we can conclude, I'm sure everybody's happy of that, with returning to the question of what happened to the revolution. Now I approach this question very differently than I did 30 years ago. Now I do not think modern revolutions should be thought of as wars to create radically new types of governments, culminating in single dramatic moments of regime change, such as depicted by Iqbal Ahmed, actually, who was a part of the creation of the famous movie The Battle of Algiers. I think that revolution now is much better thought of as a forced, coercive, awkward, contested, but not always necessarily extremely violent, but usually to some extent violent, political intervention to purge empire from the nation. If a nation is to include all the citizens, they need to be able to voice and remedy their exclusion, their marginality, and their deprivation. We can think of revolution as organized political action to make that happen. Large-scale military revolutions do happen periodically, and they can overthrow imperial systems, but they have many disabilities. They spawn military and bureaucratic regimes, which, however progressive and responsive, typically enforce loyalty, squash dissent, and maintain imperial ranks of command. Liberal democracy seemed like a better idea because it's more responsive to the various voices demanding change, but elected officials must always translate and repackage radical demands to subsume a kind of majority mainstream, which ends up being the kind of the soup within which the demands are cooked. And this limits the capacity of these kinds of regimes to actually reduce, let alone to eliminate inequalities in the political economy. So autocracy and democracy both get stuck in the ruts of the status quo and need some strenuous pushing out of the status quo periodically, and the forces for this pushing actually typically seem to come from localities in the margins. And this is where it becomes very tempting to think about decentralization and localization as being a kind of a solution to the problem of reallocating power toward localities. This is a very interesting procedure, and I think we should all think very long and hard about it. But it has a number of problems built into it. One, of course, is that decentralization really faces a very, very strong resistance from certain kinds of forces in the political system. There are plenty of places in South Asia, in India, for example, where decentralization is going on in a very, very natural way. And there are other places, like the Northeast, like Kashmir and various other places, or in Sri Lanka, where decentralization is the demand that's being resisted by the central state and by the major political parties of the state. Now, what makes the difference between a place where decentralization seems like a normal operation of politics, accommodation of local demands, and a decentralization that is fought to the death, more or less, by the ruling elites? It's for everyone to consider, but I would say that one of the ways to think about it would be that where the regions where secession, where disloyalty, where opposition to the state become built into regions, where oppositional movements become well established, it becomes more difficult for national governments or for central governments to actually allow decentralization to occur, because it implies and begins to mean a loss of territory. Whereas if the territories are fully centrally controlled, totally inside the national mainstream, then decentralization just means a reorganization of power. So decentralization is actually a very, very politically difficult and important problem. Now, all of this, needless to say, resonates with what's going on inside Nepal. But there's one thing that I think I haven't heard so much of since I've been here, which is that globalization is complicating the situation really very dramatically. And one of the ways I like to say this is that globalization is actually financing decentralization or devolution of power inside countries. And financing it with the collusion of national governments. In other words, national governments are actually attracting FDI and foreign investment and international investment and even national investment, actually, and foreign partnerships and so on, and capital accumulation by decentralizing government. So these two processes are going on together, and it's creating new types of regimes that in some instances I think you could see right away are becoming increasingly incoherent. And India is a perfect example, where you have a murderously anti-Muslim capitalist regime in Gujarat, where investment is just flowing in like crazy, where where money is just being made by the bucket and by the truckload and the carload and the trainload, and where the politics is just nastier and more exclusionary and more brutal with every passing day. At the same time, as you've got these egalitarian sort of communist, poverty-stricken regime in Kerala, where no capitalist in their right mind is going to invest there, and on and on and on, you have this this country that's being created as a kind of a mosaic of different types of environments within the framework of globalization. The globalization is making a big difference here, and this is also happening in China, but we don't need to go into all the details. But China and India are both becoming, shall we say, mosaic nations, mosaic countries within this framework. And where these localities are operating in relation to states, local regions, and also global business at the same time. So that's one problem. The second problem is, and I'm sad to have to report, that with all this decentralization, which sounds like a good solution from the point of view of spatial inequalities in national states, this decentralization is also accompanying and perhaps even driving in some kind of way increasing economic inequality among people inside all these countries. Decentralization, devolution of power, globalization of the market economy is widening disparities between the rich and poor inside localities, inside regions, and inside countries. Okay. Poverty is declining in absolute terms in much of Asia, but gaps between rich and poor people in places are growing. Devolution and localization do not necessarily reduce economic inequality. They might be a solution to political demands for the redistribution of political power, but they're not necessarily the solution to the improvement of economic conditions so as to make all national citizens more equally part of the nation. And in fact, sad to say, a lot of the existing growth in levels of inequality in Asia and in South Asia particularly are following fairly standard patterns that differentiate the old metropolitan centers from the more rustic peripheries, that increase the relative poverty of minorities, which channel wealth generally into the hands of people who are disproportionately already better off. Many analysts like to think of this as being a characteristic of capitalism, but I think that's entirely too abstract, because this is a proposition that's going on inside communist countries and types of formerly socialist regimes. It's being driven by state politics, by local politics, by populism, by ethnic politics. It's being driven in a lot of different ways. So the question then becomes, how poor people in poor places can effectively participate in the nation by fighting the continued reproduction of imperial inequality? This remains an open question. Now, one answer is that it's consistent with the ideas about globalization is that we need to address these inequalities one individual at a time through markets, NGOs, and electoral politics. And this is a very tempting solution, which is to say economic development will solve the problem. We have egalitarian, pro-poor economic development policies, and this will solve the problem. But unfortunately, that leaves the political problem out again. In other words, you've got the economic problem being solved by these kinds of pro-poor policies, but that the political problem and the social problem isn't dealt with in those ways. Because individuals who are poor do not just live in poverty. They don't just live in countries. They live in real places. They live in swamps and farms and in mountains and in slums and so on. They don't live in abstract localities. They live in real localities. And they're real localities filled with ethnicity, filled with filled with their own solidarities, localities that often in their view, and in my view also actually can be thought of as being prior to the nation and not simply objects of national administration. So with all this considered, I return to the idea that the spatial limitation of movements for social justice in the world today, these spatial limitations are actually virtues and sources of strength because they focus local politics on local inequalities, local inequalities that have been fostered by imperial modernity and which have actually been sustained by modern states and are now being accentuated by neoliberal globalization. So it seems, in other words, just to try to figure out a way to end here, that somehow the affirmation and the actual revitalization of bursts of local radicalism seem to me like they might well be good medicine that will keep nations on a progressive path, even if swallowing the medicine is a bit difficult. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon. The local basis for these struggles is really quite clear, even as their national politics become more and more dramatic.
Thank you, David, for giving us a lot to think about. As was mentioned earlier, we don't have in the Regmi lecture series a Q&A session. However, I can assure you that David loves to talk. So outside, while having tea, I invite you to gather him and engage him in in conversations that come out of his lecture. So now I invite all of you for tea outside. Thank you.